Hello, my name is Paul Emanovich. I'm the Managing Director of Participedia, the world's largest database and one of the largest global research communities studying and mobilizing knowledge about democratic innovation. Welcome everyone to today's Teaching Cafe on interracial communication and public participation. As we explore how to communicate effectively across racial and cultural boundaries, we'll hear from an incredible panel of researchers and practitioners from South Africa, Ghana, the UK, and the United States. Together, we'll reflect on techniques, challenges, and promising practices for incorporating interracial communication pedagogy into our teaching and training, all with the goal of fostering more inclusive, effective, and equitable democratic engagement. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Our first two speakers are Dr. Robert Richards, longtime Participedia co-investigator and associate professor at the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service, where he teaches on communication and civic engagement broadly, and Penelope Nortey, a master's candidate at the Clinton School of Public Service, a Participedia researcher, and an international student from Ghana who specializes in inclusive community-based engagement strategies. I will also add she is also a prospective PhD. And following these two, we will be guided by Dr. Temidayo Eseonu, lecturer in politics and policy at Lancaster University and convener of the Racial Equity and Policy Network. Her work centers on the lived experience of racialized peoples and the ongoing struggles for racial justice. And lastly, but not least, Dr. Rebecca Freeth, a senior consultant, dialogue facilitator, organizational development practitioner, and writer who specializes in designing and facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues, scenario exercises, and social labs, who's also based in Betty's Bay, South Africa. Before I pass it off, I do want to note that the opinions expressed by Robert and Penelope are solely their personal opinions and do not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Arkansas system or the Clinton School of Public Service. Thank you again for taking the time to join us for today's Teaching Cafe. I'll pass it off to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So today we'll be talking about motivations and goals for incorporating interracial communication training into our public participation courses and trainings. We'll discuss key concepts, some teaching techniques, resources, and adaptation strategies, some complexities of doing this work. Then we'll present some practical scenarios, and you'll have a chance to work in breakout rooms to apply some of these ideas to those factual scenarios. We'll hear reports out from your breakout groups, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So why should we do this? Why should we build instruction in interracial communication into our public participation courses and trainings? Well, a major reason is that many of our societies are racially diverse, but they also feature racial inequality due to histories of domination, of enslavement, of colonialism, and legally enforced racial segregation. So community members and students often need guidance on how to communicate effectively across lines of racial difference and racial inequality. So our goals today are to explore some key concepts and teaching techniques and resources, some ways to adapt those techniques and resources to particular contexts, some complexities of doing this work, to give you a chance to apply these concepts and ideas to some realistic scenarios, and then some time to reflect on this educational approach and its implications. And now I'll turn things over to Dayo and Rebecca to talk about some key concepts.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether that's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're based. So I'm Dayo, and I'll be talking through or offering some of the sort of concepts that we'll be kind of referring to throughout our time together this well, afternoon in my case. So starting with kind of the language. So for us, we think of race as a social construct and not in terms of a biological reality. In saying that race is a social construct, we're not saying that racism isn't real, but we are very much saying kind of the categorization of people based on race is kind of we assign meanings to this kind of categories, and we assign, and through these kind of meanings, there are different unequal relationships within that, and the impact, the material impact of these categorizations are important for us to kind of, as we think about a racially just society. The other sort of thing to think about the terms that we use, so depending on the context that you work in, you might be more familiar with maybe Black, Indigenous people of color, or people of color. In the UK, we use, or some people use BAME, so Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. So there are lots of kind of different terms, but we will be using racially minoritized, and that was a term that was coined by Gudnaram Nam. And the idea behind kind of racially minoritized is to give some sense of the active processes of racialization that designate certain attributes of groups in particular contexts as being a minority or in a minority position. So it's that verb of minoritized rather than minority. It really kind of centers the way that systems have worked to socially structure society, where there are groups kind of, there's a hierarchical positioning of white at the top and non-white in sort of different levels of racialization. So we will be referring to racially minoritized as we go through the session. The second kind of offering that we'll be producing or offering today is the concept of safe spaces and brave spaces. So Kenna introduced the term safe space, and I think that's sort of probably more widely known, asking that when people are in sort of participatory or deliberative processes, that we ensure that those who are most marginalized can speak and act freely. And it was very much around generating collective and collaborative strategies for resistance, but with lots of co-opted terminologies. We think that it has lost some of that intention of how to make sure that marginalized participants can speak freely from a place of collective strength. And then so sort of critiquing this idea of safety or safety, as James Baldwin talks about, the idea of safe spaces being an illusion. We can't guarantee that people will feel safe when talking about race or racism. We can't we don't know what people are bringing into that space, so we don't know what their triggers might be. And so to sort of set up a space as safe, there's risk to that. And so Araro and Clemens offered a different alternative called brave spaces. And sort of the pillars of the brave spaces is that we cultivate spaces that welcome sort of contrasting and dissenting views. It starts with kind of a clear agreement on what respect looks like and how to sort of readily adopt a consensus on the importance of respect. It doesn't shy away from kind of the more kind of tension or difficult, trickier conversations. It might mean that some people will need to sit with discomfort of some of the conversations that will be discussed in these spaces, but it really supports people in differentiating between a personal attack and, in setting up what respect looks like. It shouldn't be a personal attack, but it's kind of encouraging challenges to mindsets, ideas, or beliefs, and really ask that people reflect on their own positionality, their identities and the values that they sort of are socialized into or very kind of clearly sign up to. And so it was important in sort of creating the brave spaces as part of being respectful, to think about words and actions and the impact that those can have on other people. And then Rickard and Villarreal reminded us that actually, even within these brave spaces, we need to really be aware of who's doing the emotional labor of being brave, who's the one that's sort of sharing a lot of their own, trying to sort of make white people feel more comfortable, who's having to explain things all the time about sort of particular realities. And so we need to kind of think about creating these safer, braver spaces, knowing that actually we can't promise safety. We can sort of say, Loretta J. Ross suggests that we can say that we would help people to kind of, stretch their thinking and embrace kind of some of these difficulties, but in a way that is respectful to who people are. The sort of third concept that we will be sort of introducing, again, from Loretta J. Ross, and she's just written a book. I think it's published already in America, not yet in the UK. I think that's next month. But she talks about, so when we are in these brave spaces, when we are teaching kind of, or in places where there are sort of interracial communications, how do you then deal with some of the tensions that come out, whether that's kind of intentional or unintentional? So she talks about the typical way people call people out. So you demand that people, change their tone or don't say that, in a bid to hold them accountable. And she includes the cancel culture as part of that calling out. So which demands punishment. So whether that's job loss or deplatforming and other kind of consequences. And she critiques that idea. I think because of her background is kind of abolitionist, kind of human reproduction. And she was saying that actually that cancel culture is linked to that sort of the need to punish people. But she suggests instead that we call people in. We have, when we're having, actually have these difficult dialogues with people, whether that's publicly or privately, while respecting kind of human rights and differences that occur, just as kind of being people, being human. And what's really key, and it's really changed my way as well of approaching people who who don't share the same kind of values as I do in the same way. And she talks about this idea of radical love and radical generosity. So resisting the urge to throw people away, but to actually invest, believe in the humanity of others, give them a chance to self-reflect, to apologize, to repair, and to change behavior. But critically, she doesn't think that calling in is always appropriate. And particularly, for example, if whoever's kind of you were trying to call in doesn't acknowledge the humanity of others, or is actually not even accepting responsibility for the harm that might have been caused as part of these conversations. And she suggests some examples of how you do that. So what are the practicalities of when you do need to call somebody in? So she gives some examples, and in her book we'll go into much more detail about it. So I will recommend having that. And I think books like Having Courageous Conversations as well will be really useful tools in thinking about how to navigate interracial communications. So some examples, I noticed that the conversation just got tense. Can we pause to investigate why? Because what tends to happen, and I've seen this, is people, when there's something kind of a racial moment, people either ignore it and kind of let it pass. People can sense it in the room, but facilitators can sometimes let it pass. But actually, calling someone in is just to, let's pause to investigate why. Can we revisit something that felt like disrespect for me? And when you use that term, can you explain more? I'm not sure what you meant. Do you know what the term signifies or connotes? So it's more sort of inviting people into a conversation rather than kind of shutting down and and letting people feel, so yeah, it's more about kind of inviting dialogue. So I'll now pass on to Rebecca to take us through to the final kind of concept for this section.
Thanks, Dio, and hi, everybody. I'm going to say a bit about white fragility. This is a concept that Robin DiAngelo has written and spoken about extensively. And if we can imagine, just to make this kind of as real as possible, using Dio's example of brave spaces, imagining that in the context of brave conversations, the pattern that often happens, not always, but often happens, is that racially minoritized people are invited or take the space to share their own experiences of racism. And in that context, white fragility can quite often show up. And white fragility looks like shame or guilt or defensiveness, anger, denial, etc. but it shows up in ways that recenters white people and our feelings and can sidetrack or even sabotage the conversation itself. And then the difficulty is that racially minoritized people then have a difficult choice to make. Do we continue with the conversation? Do we soldier on despite the fact that there's a lot of heightened emotion? People might be upset or leaving the room. Or do we take care of the feelings of white people? And this is a particularly difficult choice when there are significant relationships at stake, when it's an intact team or an organization or a group of people who will stay connected outside of the classroom or outside of the workshop. And so it can be tempting or expected to take care of white people's fragility. Regardless of what happens, there's often an expectation, a tacit expectation that racially minoritized people will do the emotional labor of bringing the brave conversation while trying not to trigger white fragility. And it's in this context that affinity groups, and particularly white affinity groups, can be very useful as places for white people to invest their emotional labor in building more awareness, more resilience, and more readiness for interracial conversations. And we'll speak more about affinity groups a bit later. And I'll just end by saying that a counterpoint to white fragility is what Loretta J. Ross offers as white courage, which draws on the advantages and privileges of whiteness to dismantle white supremacy, not as a white savior, not as a self-appointed ally, but as somebody working alongside racially minoritized people to democratize privilege and use it well. And I'll hand back to you, Robert and Penelope, to take us forward.
Thank you, Rebecca. And now we'll talk about some teaching techniques and resources and adaptation strategies derived from the UK, from South Africa, and from the Southern United States. And I'll start by talking about the UK. And these ideas are from Dayo, so thank you very much, Dayo. The first approach in teaching interracial communication concerns recontextualization. So the idea here is that contemporary understandings of racism have been divorced from histories of domination, from violent histories that they stem from. So it's important to recontextualize interracial interactions today in the context of that history, because unless our learners make that connection to the history, we can't move forward to bring reform to a more just society. A second point is that interracial communication involves fostering understanding and positive relationships among diverse groups. But that's most effective when all the parties share a common understanding of the challenges faced by racially minoritized groups. Well, we know that there's inequality in perspective taking, inequality of knowledge. Members of racially majoritized groups, because of segregation, often don't regularly engage in perspective taking and often lack knowledge of the communication practices and lived experience of individuals in racially minoritized groups. So we can structure our instruction to encourage that kind of perspective taking and learning. Second third is to avoid the assumption that students know. So since school curricula don't engage with these histories in various countries around the world, a good default assumption for educators and trainers is to assume that we need to inform proactively about historical racial injustice and current conditions of racial injustice. And fourth, to connect discussions of contemporary racism to histories of the transatlantic enslavement of people, colonialism, and ongoing coloniality. For example, discussing how stereotypes began when interpreting their current function, and showing pictures, whether personally taken or internet images and videos of historical artifacts and events. And finally, decentering the United States and centering instead racial regimes in Europe, South Africa, and Australia. And now I'll turn over to Penelope to discuss teaching techniques and resources from South Africa.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Okay, so these are some of the teaching techniques that have been used by Rebecca in South Africa. Okay, so the very first point talks about building personal awareness and flexibility about power, privilege, and participation in a dialogue. And in order to do that, there is a need to create a shared vocabulary. Now, by drawing inference from Mendel's use of rank, which he introduces this concept as to describe different levels of power and privilege that individuals hold based on race, based on some factors such as the race, gender, and then social economic status. Now, the second point talks about building in time for personal reflection and small group conversations. Now, in order to do that, now this actually helps one to identify his or her rank and find out about blind spots, as well as offering a way to think about how the rank is expressed in dialogue, which includes patterns of censoring and marginalizing particular voices. Now, this very technique talks about practicing dialogue with self-awareness of rank dynamics, which would help individuals to adjust their communication styles to be more equitable. Now, this practice actually encourages active listening, humility, and then a commitment to amplifying these marginalized voices rather than dominating discussions. So we'll move forward to speak about Yes, thank you. So we'll move forward to speak about the teaching techniques and resources that is here in the Southern US. So we dwell on this very book by Aubrey and Harris, 2003. Now, this particular book covers many forms of context of communication. So according to Aubrey and Harris, dialogue is an intentional and reciprocal exchange where individuals would seek mutual understanding. While conflict resolution involves strategies to manage, resolve disagreements rising from cultural and racial differences. The text also covers dimensions of communications, emotion, psychology, and behaviors. It also covers literature and then major theories such as the anxiety uncertainty management theory. Now, this particular theory suggests that effective communication depends on reducing anxiety and uncertainty when interacting with people from different racial or cultural backgrounds. Now, the text also emphasizes on some practical guidance and personal stories. Now, beyond the theory that Aubrey and Harris had mentioned, they also provide real-life stories and practical strategies to illustrate how interracial communication plays out in an everyday situation. And there is also, lastly, a glossary of technical terms behind the book, which gives a list of technical terms that has been used throughout the book, which will grant you the much understanding of how these terms are being used. Now, we also dwell on some articles. These are other readings and resources. Some articles from Interracial Friendship Development, Racial Caste as a Form of Structural Racism, Interracial Dialogue in Classroom and the Community, Storytelling in Interracial Dialogue, How Race Relates to Hyde's Moral Foundation Theory, and Interracial Communication in Healthcare. And there's these two videos as well, that is post-dialogue debriefing in class and post-dialogue written reflections. Now, these resources will be made available to each and every participant right after the teaching cafe is done. So I'd hand over to Robert to continue with the teaching techniques from the South US.
Thank you, Penelope. And I apologize for the instability in the slides. So a key part of our teaching in the Southern US is to enable students to apply these ideas about interracial communication through experiential learning in the form of dialogues. So students hold practice dialogues in the classroom using procedures from the Coming to the Table interracial dialogue organization and based upon ideas that they read in the Aubrey and Harris interracial communication textbook. And then students have the option to also facilitate interracial dialogues in the community with our local chapter of Coming to the Table. And these exercises also feature opportunities for reflection. So in class, after their practice dialogue, students collectively reflect through a debriefing discussion. And then when students facilitate dialogues in the community, they reflect by writing a written reflection after their dialogue. And then finally, students also get an opportunity to apply their ideas by designing an original interracial communication process. As an example, our student, Korean Thomas, created an interracial dialogue experience called Building Bridges for Inclusive Spaces about land use planning, racial justice and land use planning. And then several months after he completed our course, the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Urban Land Institute gave him an opportunity to implement this event. So we actually held this event, and these are some photographs that he gave us permission to share with you about this interracial discussion event that he conducted in the community. And now I'll turn things over to Penelope to talk about adaptation techniques for teaching or adapting these teaching and learning resources to particular contexts, in which case we'll talk about planning, implementation, facilitation, and evaluation.
Okay, thank you. So with the very first one, which is the planning, there is actually a need to involve local residents in the planning process, and then also to put community engagement at the center. Now, prioritizing community engagement helps to build trust, it promotes inclusivity, and then also ensures that teaching strategies align with the local values and the needs. And then there is also a need to devote sufficient time and resources for the planning process. And then also there is still under planning, there is still the need to monitor current and recurring events in the region and locality. Now, staying very informed about the local events and trends would actually help to be timely and then also relevant in the ongoing issues. We would then move to the implementation strategies. The very first one is to involve the local residents, as I had mentioned, in the planning process, in conducting the process. Now, bringing these local residents into the planning phase would actually foster more inclusivity, as I had mentioned earlier. And then also you could include them by making them 1, co-instructors, 2, facilitators, and then also community partners. Now, partnering with these local organizations and leaders would actually strengthen the connection between education and the community. I would also pass on to Robert to continue with the other 2 explanations.
Thank you, Penelope. Facilitation is another adaptation approach. So, for example, training facilitators adequately on how to support equitable participation, how to call in rather than call out participants, as Dayo discussed, meeting the accessibility needs of the participants in a culturally sensitive manner, for example, through use of interpreters, offering childcare, and then evaluating. So continually gathering feedback from participants and then using that feedback to adapt and change our teaching techniques to make them better suited to the local context. And then to also expect to be changed. One of our conclusions in doing this work is that we ourselves as educators are often transformed through this process. Now we'll turn things over to Rebecca and Dayo to discuss complexities.
Thanks so much, Robert. So as you can imagine, and as you know from experience, there are multiple complexities to navigate in this work, and we're going to name just 2. The first is about setting up affinity groups. And the question is, the dilemma here is, are affinity groups consistent with the notion of interracial communication, or are they at odds? And I'll just explore it a bit here. I know from my own experience that when working with groups on interracial communication, it can be really helpful to create affinity groups to complement the conversations that are happening in the larger group. And here, when I talk about affinity, I'm referring to racial identity, with the idea that conversations among people who share a racial identity can provide space for a different, more vulnerable conversation without being observed by the racialized other. There's a really fascinating website called Justice Unbound, which includes an article that advocates for holding affinity groups when doing the work of anti-racism. And they make 5 arguments for why these can be useful. I'll just name a couple of them. One is that when white people talk about white supremacy, this can traumatize racially minoritized people who instead deserve space to grieve, lament, share stories and emotions in community. And I've also found that these spaces can be used to explore differences of opinion and experience and to hold each other accountable away from the gaze of white people. And there can be real value in doing that work together. Similarly, white people have work to do together and can do the work of addressing unexamined beliefs around white supremacy and white privilege in an affinity group. I've been part of several such groups in South Africa and found particularly Layla Saad's handbook, a workbook, Me and White Supremacy, just exceptionally valuable. If you haven't got it yet, and if you're a white person or somebody who identifies as white on this call, please do yourself a favor and grab a copy. So one of the complexities here is that in the context of interracial communication, there may be resistance to people being separated into different groups. As the Justice Unbound article states, and I quote, "It may go against the rainbow and sunshine type of nicety and superficial reconciliation that sometimes creeps into anti-racism work. Another complexity is about how people are allocated to affinity groups. And it's really important that people self-select into an affinity group, including choosing to be in a group of people who prefer not to identify according to their race. And that's the beauty of public participation and deep democracy. A second area of complexity we wanted to explore was that of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to demonstrate the need to account for, and I quote here, for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. So of course, today we're really focusing on racial identity, but in reality, intersectionality refers to the really deeply intertwined and interconnected nature of social identities, where we all come with our own experiences of race, gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity, age, etc. And it's understanding that these aspects don't exist in isolation, they impact each other, and in different contexts, these identities might carry different weights. And so coming back to this idea of an affinity group, a Black middle-class member of the group might feel greater subjective affinity to a middle-class group of white people than to a working-class group of Black people. And this is part of the complexity. And if we have a look at the next slide, there's just a brilliant graphic produced by Tessa Watkins, who's adapted the work of others to produce this wheel, which differentiates between no less than 18 aspects of identity, including neurodiversity, body size, employment status, and housing status, alongside what in this case she calls skin color. And this helps to understand, this wheel helps to understand in a very visual way how different combinations of identities can create privilege or erasure or marginalization. And it's worth saying that, of course, all of us, when we look at this wheel, find ourselves in different parts of the wheel. There are places where we have privilege, there are places where we might experience erasure, there are places where we might experience marginalization. And I think a key learning for me, and something to explore, perhaps in the Q&A or in other places, is that we tend to identify first with the places where we feel erased or marginalized. And it's much more difficult to own the places where we feel privileged and have power. And again, that's part of the complexity in the classroom or in the workshop. And so I'm going to hand back to, I think it's you, Robert, but I'm actually not sure who I'm handing back to at this point.
That's fine. Thank you, Rebecca. And Penelope now is going to introduce our scenarios.
Okay, thank you very much. So this very part of the teaching cafe, in order to get a lot more practical with what we've spoken so far, we have some very interesting scenarios which would help us apply what we have actually learned. And by doing so, we'll be breaking out into some breakout group sections and would assign some scenarios to the various groups. And just kindly note that the link to the instructions for the various scenarios will be posted in the chat. So once you enter into your breakout room, just quickly check the chat and then you'll find that instructions right there, which would help you to go through the scenarios.
Well, thank you all very much. I hope those discussions were very rewarding. And then we wanted to do some reflection on that application experience by hearing some reports from the groups. Penelope kindly agreed to take some notes on our discussion, and we'll make these notes available to you after the teaching cafe. So folks from Group 1, who's your reporter, and what were some key points from your discussion that you'd like to share with us?
I'd love to invite Candace to share back for our group if you're willing. We didn't get a chance to find that, but
I'll try. But we spoke of the context of the discussion that was happening in the first scenario, the location of where this was happening, assuming it was in the United States, but making sure that students' concerns were validated first, but also making sure that we grounded, we're giving the historical kind of context of why white and Black should be discussed, going back to how certain systems were created to, ensure that certain people were kept out of them, and things like that, but also making sure that, as Paul mentioned, we could bridge that by showing the similarities that other cultures had experienced. I think I got it all, y'all. So.
Great. Thank you. So emphasizing historical context, affirming the speaker, and underlying the significance of the topic, and the need to discuss racial difference and racial inequality. Thank you. And Candace, thanks very much for coming today. Really appreciate it. So group number 2, who's your reporter, and what were some key points from your discussion?
Cassie, do you want to go?
I think you should share, Hillary.
Okay. All right, I'll do my best. We had a great combo, we were actually not being good students and didn't get to the prompt quick enough. We were talking about what each other does, but once we got to the prompt, we established that so our prompt was, we chose number 1, how would you explain the historical and social context of race in the United States to someone who was from another country? We talked about directing the question kind of back to them. Tell us more about your experience in this instance in Brazil with racial identities and potentially othering in your country, and then talking about doing small group discussions, creating as safe a space as possible in small group discussions with, what has your experience been in the United States with race, so that we start doing some storytelling and have individuals participate, the whole class participate, but in small group discussions, and then potentially have report outs to make sure that the conversation was in a smaller space, potentially a little bit of a safer space to do that story sharing, and also just expand the experience into individual experiences that have happened personally in the room. Did I miss anything, Cassie? Or Penelope? Penelope helped us as well.
I think you did a great job by Smart and everything else. Yes, we captured that.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary.
Great. Thank you so much, Hillary. First of all, thank you very much for coming. And so part of what I heard was inviting the participant, making the interaction conversational, emphasizing storytelling, and then using liberating structures to scale down the discussion and then scale it up once participants feel more comfortable. doing so, providing supports to the participant. Great, thank you. And so group number 3, who is your reporter? And what are some of the key points of your discussion that you'd like to share with the group?
Great. So I'm reporting for group 3, and in our group was Sharon, Sarah, and Deo. And our scenario, we got to talking about the answer to question 1, and it was really the scenario was putting pressure on a participant to vocalize the marginalized voice. And so our reflection was that the participant shouldn't even be in that situation. But if they were, what they might be able to do is influence the facilitator in some way to get some support for them and their voice. Also, perhaps lobby other participants to create a kind of collective position for a room that's where they feel marginalized. So that's as far as we got. But it felt very helpful to just empathize with the burden of the participant.
Thank you. So part of what I heard was providing supports to the participant and empathizing, but also trying to empower them and provide them opportunities to exercise their agency to the greatest extent. Does that sound right? Great. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for sharing those insights with us. We're very grateful for your participation, and now we wanted to have some period of question and answer, and I think Dio will be moderating this part of our discussion. So I'll hand things over to Dio for to lead our question and answer session.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for engaging with the offerings and the scenarios. So just opening up the space now for any kind of questions that people might have, either on the concepts that we kind of introduced at the start, so maybe some complexities that we've talked about, other complexities that we may not have sort of shared in the short time that we have together. But yeah, we've just got some time now to be in conversation. So Hillary, is that a hand?
Yeah, so I was trying to find the emoji and I couldn't. I do have our question, something that, and I kind of have an idea based on what you've said already, but so we tend to facilitate workshops with people that are on a broad spectrum of their, I guess I could say, enlightenment journey in terms of racial inequity in the United States. I sometimes grapple with the question of how we make sure that we are not, as facilitators, say there are very few racially minoritized people in the room. If there are people that are white people in the room that really do not have a concept of, like say things like, there's no way that you had a different education because you were Black. As an example, as a facilitator, making sure that I'm not, and a white person, making sure that I'm not overly protecting the minoritized people in the room and assuming that I need to kind of take that education burden on myself while not burdening them with explaining to the white people why racial inequity exists. Does my question make sense? Like, walking that line between being protecting the racially minoritized people in the room while at the same time creating spaces for education.
Yeah. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to take that and then I can add in.
I thought you might throw it this way. It's a tough one, Hillary. I just think there's very little right or wrong here. So I'll just share what I might do in that situation, which is I might make visible the fact that that's a request, that there is a kind of request for education, and say kind of make it transparent in the group. Like as the facilitator, I could take that, or maybe somebody would like to share a personal experience. And just, I guess, kind of raise awareness about the burden of education and the burden of the kind of emotional labor of education, and check like who's going to take, like who wants to take on that role, making myself available as one of the people who could. And so it's like in that way, I would think of that as a way of seeking to be a good ally without making a decision on behalf of racially minoritized people about whether they want to do the work or not. And so it's kind of almost negotiating in front of everybody about who would do the work. Dio.
Yeah, and and I think something that I always do, particularly with kind of equity oriented facilitation, is regardless of the topic, is to have some statistical evidence or example or stories that show and kind of highlight the inequalities. So it's not on any, you're not taking kind of the education burden. You know, the racially minoritized people might not want to share those experiences, particularly if people have already kind of been epistemically unjust in terms of denying their realities. So it's kind of like, actually, this is a factual, and, you know, thankfully there's loads of evidence in like whatever country you're based in around these racial inequalities. And I always have those facts to hand to kind of just say, you know, interesting that you say that, but are you aware that actually X, Y, and Z, and it's sort of, you know, in that moment, you're not taking on the burden of education, but you, as part of your preparation for the event, you have this to hand. So I'm conscious of the time, and we could go on and happy to kind of have conversations offline about this, but are there any other sort of quick, well, maybe not quick, but questions? And I guess if people are okay, sorry, Paul, I'm kind of, I don't know whether there's there's room for us to maybe stay a little bit longer if people are happy with that, in case there were any kind of burning questions that people wanted to explore while we are in the online room or space together. Any questions or comments or thoughts? Okay, I'm going to hand back now to Paul. Actually, I'm not sure who I'm handing it back to, just to close us off, but thank you for engaging with the space. It's been really kind of great for us to, well, work together to pull this off and offer this to you guys, and also for you to engage with the scenarios. But yeah, I'll pass it back to the Participedia team to sort of wrap up and close us off.
I think that was an excellent wrap up already, Dio. So thank you everyone for joining us. We'll make all these resources and supporting documents available, as well as the kind of collective notes from our ending discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and please have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.